friend to all animals, but growing up in rural East Tennessee, I lived a very isolated existence and always had dogs. Dogs are my friends. Dogs are my friends when I didn't have any friends. My dogs never judged me. They didn't care that I wore Coke bottle glasses or that my mom put Brill cream in my hair and dressed me in oddly colored clothes from the Husky Boys section. And they were always there, smiling, happy to see me when I got home from school or to spend the weekend with me out in the woods. And if I shared my peanut butter and jelly sandwich, they were all the more happier. To this day, they're dogs that I still think of every day and grieve over. This video goes to show just how good of a friend a dog can be. Any donations to this video will in turn be redonated to the Old Friends Senior Dog Sanctuary in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. Help an old friend out. Hello friends, Steve Stockton here with you. Welcome to a special episode called My Dog Saved Me. And a lot of these cases we cover, people that get lost hiking often have their dogs with them. Sometimes neither the person nor the dog is ever seen again. There are other times that the person is never found, but the dog returns. If only dogs could talk in these cases. However, today, got something a little different. These are cases where people miraculously made it after being lost in the woods, but they contend that they were saved by their dog. So, cuddle up with human's best friend or your fur baby, sit back, relax, and have a listen. My dog saved me. First up, have the Great Bear Wilderness Rescue. Madeline Connolly. A 23-year-old Illinois woman, Madeline Connolly, went missing with her dog, Mogi, in the Great Bear Wilderness area in Montana on May 4th, 2017. Connolly was only supposed to be gone on an overnight camping trip, but didn't return. The search and rescue mission was launched on the 6th of May. Realizing she wasn't in the right place on the first night, she became lost and wandered farther into the wilderness and away from her vehicle. Thinking if she just stayed on the trail she was on, she would eventually make it back to her car, she walked for hours and ended up at a lake. Knowing that she was far from where she should be, she stopped there for a while. Even though she had no shelter and was lightly dressed, Connolly had to seek shelter under the trees at night and share body heat with her dog. Not realizing the media attention the case was getting, the last day she thought she would make it back to her car, go for a Coke, and return to her uncle's house. In fact, several search and rescue teams had already begun looking for the woman. She was found safe on Mother's Day, a search and rescue team, 2-Bear Air Rescue, and was lifted to safety. Connolly was visiting family in Montana, on her way to a job at a bakery in Alaska. The dog, Mogi, was also found alive, and they were reunited the next day after Connolly was released from the hospital. Connolly claims that without the dog to keep her warm, she probably would have perished. Next, we have Lost in Canada, the story of Annette Poitras. 56-year-old British Columbian dog walker Annette Poitras went missing after falling on a hike and knocking herself unconscious. Poitras left her house with Bubba, Roxy, and Chloe for a little walk in the woods when she slipped and fell, hitting her head. In the fall, she also lost her phone and gloves. She doesn't remember how long she was out for, but when she came back around, she had to go find one of the 3 dogs that had wandered off while she was knocked out. After finding the dog, she tried following the BC Hydro power lines, but was too weak. By her second night being lost, over 100 search and rescue personnel were raised, and people were out looking for her and the dogs. Her third day in the elements was her last. Rescuers heard one of the dogs barking and was able to find Poitras and her furry friends all alive and well. She spent a week in the hospital due to exposure from the elements, and in an interview she said she didn't think she would have survived one more night in the elements. Annette Poitras was able to turn her ordeal into a novel. Author Anne Bruin spent an entire week with her family while writing the novel based on the recollection of Poitras about the 3 days she spent missing in the BC wilderness. The name of the book is 3 Dog Nights and covers both the missing woman's perspective as well as that of her family. I would have probably died without the dogs, Poitras said. They kept me going, and they kept me warm. I don't know how I survived the Utah wilderness. Danielle Ballinger. Deciding to get into better shape for several winter triathlons and a snowshoe racing season event, world champion adventure athlete Danielle Ballinger set out to the Utah wilderness to get in some exercise with her companion, Taz. She hadn't been to this loop in a while, and Taz, her dog, was excited to go for a run. Danielle is known for her amazing endurance and strength. While telling her story, she reminisces about the day she adopted the dog. I got him from a puppy rescue. This one puppy sort of stood out, Danielle said. He was energetic and he liked to run around. He was hyper. He had this playful attitude about him. I sort of connected with that. I remember some other lady went over to Taz and was holding him, and I looked at this lady and said to myself, that's my dog. He wasn't my dog yet, but I just knew he was the one. So I kept an eye on this lady as she was playing with Taz. As soon as she set him down, I snatched him up and said, I want this one. There's just something that drew me to Taz, that I knew he was the one for me. December 13th, 2006, Danielle had returned a few emails, grabbed a bottle of water, got Taz, and headed for her truck. She was headed out to one of her favorite spots in the Utah Canyon to do a routine run, and later that day planned on doing some kayaking. Despite the beauty of this area, few people traverse it due to the desolate location. It was a clear, sunny winter day, but the temperatures in the desert that time of year are often in the 30s during the daytime and drop into the single digits at night. Her day was planned, full of adventures with a hike and a kayaking run. When she reached the trail, she wanted to hike. Danielle observed that she was not the only person in the area. Heading out on the trail, she was about to face one of the hardest challenges she had ever endured, and it would change her life forever. The area surrounding Moab, Utah is popular for sightseeing, hiking, mountain biking, walks, and other outdoor activities. The beauty of the canyon land is alluring, but this area has a dangerous side and can be very unforgiving to anyone that dare become complacent to those dangers. The terrain can change within feet and takes lives very quickly. Just in December 2006 alone, 2 men had been fatally injured in the same area Danielle was hiking in. Specifically trained search and rescue teams are often dispatched to aid hikers, mountain climbers, and other adventurers when they meet with the worst this place of beauty has to offer. At this point in her life, Danielle had won Athlete of the Year 6 times and was in peak physical condition. Used to pushing herself to her limits and sometimes beyond, she often faced this area with no fear, as she had been here many times and knew the terrain well. Having stretched properly and drank some water to hydrate herself, Danielle headed out on an uncharted trail that led miles into the vast expanse of the desert. Taz was running ahead of her. Trying to keep up with him, Danielle picked up her pace. A few more steps at the faster pace, and suddenly Danielle lost her footing when she stepped on a loose piece of shell rock and started to slide down an embankment. Unable to stop herself, she slid all the way down to the edge of the bank and hit a 20-foot drop in freefall. I had just enough time to see my life kind of spin in my head and think, this is it. This is how I'm going to meet my end. She landed hard on her feet and then onto her side, immediately shattering her pelvis and causing internal bleeding. However, Danielle didn't know just how seriously she was injured. The place she landed was a shelf that jutted out over a sand wash that was winding its way through the canyon. She was perched another 15 feet above the bottom of the canyon. When she came to her senses after the fall and realized she thankfully wasn't dead, she immediately went into survival mode and started to take stock of her injuries, trying to figure out where she was hurt. Danielle could feel her legs, so she knew she wasn't paralyzed, but she couldn't move them. The rest of her body seemed to be okay. Her next task was to figure out how to get out of the canyon and back to her truck, as she knew she needed a hospital right away. Despite her pelvis being shattered and the pain that was starting to grip her, Danielle tried to stand up and walk out of the canyon. But because the pelvis attaches the top half of the body to the lower half, her legs simply couldn't support her weight, and she immediately fell back to the ground. With adrenaline now surging through her body, she was able to roll onto her stomach and started crawling her way out of the canyon. Knowing she was trapped on a ledge, all Danielle could do was try to go back the way she came. A few moments after she started crawling, Taz made his way onto the ledge. This was the motivation she needed to keep going. Danielle was scared that she was trapped on the sandstone shelf where she had landed, but if Taz had found a way down to her, then there had to be a way off. Danielle was able to find her way off the cliff and down to the bottom of a canyon where she had to stop and rest. She rolled over on her back and rested up against a rock. She had managed to keep her water bottle in her pocket even after she had fallen, so she drank the last of this water while contemplating her next move. She knew that the adrenaline was keeping her going and keeping the pain in check for now, but it was starting to wear off. Each movement she made now was excruciating and took much more effort than before. Danielle was well aware that the desert had already claimed 2 lives just that month, and it was now getting dark, which would drop the temperatures outside to below freezing, so she had to do everything she could to not become its next victim. Drawing on her athletic training, she used crutches to keep herself awake and keep warm. She was only able to move her upper body from her shoulders to her arms and continued doing crunches at a pace of 1 every 5 seconds all night as the temperature dropped into the low 20s. Taz cuddled up next to her, and they shared body heat, which also helped her stay warm. As the sun came up the next morning, Danielle realized she was out of water completely, and the adrenaline that had helped her so much the day prior was now totally gone, and she was in severe pain. Barely able to move, she knew she needed to find water right away. Holding her breath, she rolled over onto her stomach, and the pain shot through her like a red-hot poker. Thankfully, there was a small puddle of rainwater nearby the place she had been resting. She and Taz were able to take a few sips to keep them going for the time being. Settling in near this pitiful water source, the realization was starting to hit about her perilous situation. She knew no one was looking for her because she hadn't told anyone her plans for the day before. Unable to drag herself any further, and the water supply she had found was dwindling, Danielle had to figure out what would kill her first, dehydration or freezing. The water was full of sand and silt, and knowing water that was unfiltered could harbor harmful bacteria, she decided to conserve the water, but yet stay as close to it as she could. It didn't taste good, but it was all they had and enough to keep them going for now. This small victory of finding the water gave her some much-needed encouragement to keep trying to help herself. Drinking water also posed another problem. If she had to urinate, it could aid the hypothermia that had already started from not being able to move her legs and feet, and by this time it had already been well over 24 hours since she had gone. By midday on day 2, Danielle could tell something else was happening internally that wasn't good. She could feel an area in her abdomen that was really soft, swollen, and tender. Danielle didn't know it at the time, but she was bleeding internally. As she prepared to spend a second night in the cold desert, Danielle was finding it harder to keep in her right mind. She had started hallucinating from fatigue and blood loss. The hallucinations caused her to see bright lights in the sky and hear conversations that weren't happening. Also, the exercising that was keeping her from developing hypothermia was now almost impossible to do from the pain. Taz laid by himself the second night, and the exercising that was keeping her warm was now almost impossible. That night seemed to drag on, and everything she saw, she had to question if it was real or if she was hallucinating again. The stars looked like bright spirals hurtling towards the earth in an array of colors. Hypothermia, dehydration, internal bleeding, and cessation of bodily functions were taking a toll on the extreme athlete, and she was losing her battle to survive. Day 3 brought even more pain. Danielle could barely move and had been awake for almost 3 days. She didn't know it at the time, but she had lost almost half of her blood supply to internal bleeding. She was horribly dehydrated, had frostbite, was suffering from hypothermia, had a shattered pelvis, and was bleeding to death inside. Determined to get out on this day, she prepared herself to try for another self-rescue. Fighting back the pain, she slowly turned from her back onto her stomach as a scream escaped her mouth. Back in Moab, several phone calls had been made to the police from Danielle's family and friends. A local detective knew Danielle because she was a well-known athlete, and he knew where she trained in the desert. He was going out that way and told the other deputies he would check the area and let them know what, if anything, he discovered. Danielle, only having made it a few inches before becoming stuck in a sandy rut, she could make it no further. She was starting to lose her vision and was too weak to make any advance. She was able to make it back to her dwindling water supply as she gave in to defeat. As she lay crying, awaiting death, Taz made his way over to her and licked her tears, comforting her. The detective made his way out to the canyon, and as he came around a corner, he saw Danielle's truck, but she was nowhere in sight. He radioed his findings back to Moab, and a search and rescue mission was started within the hour. The Grand County Search and Rescue Team of Utah and the rest of the volunteers made their way out to the canyon and geared up for a rescue or possible recovery event. John Marshall, the lead search team member, would take charge of the mission. The team was briefed as they selected their other team members for certain areas so they could use the equipment brought to aid them. I was pretty close to dying at that point. I'd given up hope, Danielle recounts on the start of day 3 in the desert. I was scared no one was looking for me or they wouldn't find me. After an amazing 51 hours of not urinating, because she knew that would cause hypothermia to take hold of her even faster because of the wet clothing, her broken pelvis prevented her from being able to take her pants down, so she would have to go where she was laying. I knew I was dying. I started thinking about my life, my family, my friends, and who would care for Taz. I thought about how much they all meant to me. I really thought I was going to die. I was dying. In desperation, Danielle began talking to Taz. I need help, Taz. Danielle was crying now. Taz laid with his head on her chest, comforting her. Taz was her only chance now, and she needed him to understand her plight. Taz stood up and turned his head as if to understand what Danielle was saying to him. He turned his head from side to side, taking in each word. He started to leave and run towards the way they had come in, but just before rounding the corner from Danielle and losing sight of her, he slowly turned and looked at her. Go! Danielle shouted at Taz. With that, Taz was gone, and Danielle was all alone, injured, cold, hungry, and unable to move, literally on the verge of death. She wondered if she would ever see Taz again, or anyone for that matter. It was a hard decision to send Taz away, but he was all she had to maybe get help to her. Maybe there would be other hikers that would see him and read his tags, report it, and they would figure out where she was. She didn't want to be alone, but sending him was the only option she had left. John Marshall made it to the area where Danielle's truck was parked. After briefing on who they were looking for and where they were supposed to look, the teams started out into the canyon. Utah backcountry in the southeast area doesn't play any favorites. It's a beautiful, awe-inspiring landscape, but it can also be deadly. Captain Marshall and another team member were on a mesa looking around the area with binoculars when Marshall spotted a dog. There's a dog down there, he said to the team member. Taz had found his way out of the canyon and was headed straight to the rescuers. They knew Danielle had a dog, but fearing the dog was there because Danielle was no longer alive, this made their hearts drop. As Taz reached others in the search party, he didn't stop. His energy was high and he kept running around as if trying to get their attention. Bego Gerhardt was an experienced tracker and took notice of Taz's peculiar behavior. They noticed he wasn't interested in food and water they had provided for him. He just kept running around the trackers, trying to get their attention. Not knowing where to start looking and knowing the area was over 1,000 square miles, they pinned down a search area and sent Gerhardt on an ATV through the canyon while others went to the rim area. By the time they had started the search, evening was fast approaching. Gerhardt was the first to leave the rendezvous area, and Taz followed him. As he searched, he noticed tracks that looked a couple days old. He decided to follow the tracks, but before he could start the trail, Taz took off in front of him. Gerhardt knew Taz was taking him where they needed to go. A massive snowstorm was moving into the area and was forecasted to start that night. They knew they could only search for a few hours that evening. Only willing to follow Taz for a few more minutes, Gerhardt was having to go slow because of the terrain. Taz came running around a corner, and Danielle was in the same place when he left. She noticed that his demeanor had changed. He was high energy and ran straight for the small puddle that was their only water supply and drank heavily. His tail wagging, he went to Danielle and barked. Danielle, knowing that the water was their only lifeline now, was too weak to tell Taz no, and just watched as he drank and then barked. She didn't know Taz was bringing help, but just a short moment later, she heard the ATV. "Help!" she shouted. "I need help!" It was the best moment of my life. She had been found. "That's one good dog you have there," Gerhardt said to Danielle. Taz was a hero. Danielle was airlifted to a hospital where she underwent emergency surgery. She had 7 broken blood vessels in her pelvic area that had leaked 3 pints into her abdomen, a broken pelvis, hypothermia, and frostbite. Medical professionals feared she would never walk again. Despite her ordeal, Danielle endured 6 hours of surgery, months of rehab, and quickly regained her ability to walk. She's now married, has a baby, and Taz is right by her side. Miracle on the White Mountains. Cheryl Powell. July 11th, 2019, 60-year-old Cheryl Powell was waiting for her husband on a hillside as he turned their Jeep around at a remote campsite near the California-Nevada border when she suddenly went missing along with the couple's dog. Her husband had taken little more than about 7 minutes to move the vehicle, and when he returned to the campsite, Cheryl was nowhere to be seen. He looked for her for about a half an hour before contacting the authorities to help him search. The couple chose a remote site at the Grandview campsite near Bishop, California. Powell, an experienced hiker, hiked with her husband 24 miles per week and was a strong woman. Search teams fought through rough terrain, gullies, shale slopes, little shade, and extreme heat to search for the missing woman. Powell's husband thought she had been abducted and made a tearful plea for the safe return of his wife for 42 years. Not many details of Powell's 4-day ordeal have been released, but when she was found, it was reported that she was alive, strong, and resilient, but exhausted after having been missing for 4 days. She would later state that a man with a knife chased her off the trail and into the woods while her husband was away. Searchers first found the couple's dog and soon Cheryl. She was located near Montenegro Springs area on Monday, July 15, 2019, an area described as extremely remote. She was taken to a local hospital where she was reunited with her family. She was happy to be alive and her family was elated to see her. The dog was in great condition and was reunited with the family later the same day. Cheryl would later say, describing the ordeal, "All of a sudden, some guy pops out from behind a tree or something," describing the incident that led to her disappearance. "It was scary. I was really nervous about the fact he was threatening to do my dog harm." In an interview with NBC, Cheryl described the man as a big guy, burly, bald-headed with tan skin. She said his initial approach scared her enough to act pretty docile and let him think I was going to go along with him. She also told NBC she bolted as soon as she had the chance, although she does state that she never saw him again after the first day. Deputies interviewed people at the campground and used a loudspeaker to call out for Powell and her dog Miley. Search and rescue personnel also combed the area using people on foot, dogs, and helicopters. Late Monday morning, searchers reported finding Miley, the dog, about 2.5 miles from the campground. A short while later, they found Sherry Powell alive but exhausted. It was Miley's barking that alerted the search and rescue personnel to her presence. They found her some 200 yards away. Cheryl's son, Greg, reported on Facebook, "My mom is an amazing human being, and she looks pretty good given the situation. Her first words to us were, 'I'm so sorry I put you through that. You guys must have been so worried,' just proving how selfless she is." Danielle County Sheriff's Office also reported that searchers were happy to have found Cheryl Powell and Miley alive. "We're grateful that Ms. Powell and her dog were found alive and well," the department reported on Facebook. "Our office is actively investigating the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. We have no further information at this time." Next up, we have Little Girl Lost, the story of Victoria Bench. Mom and daughter had just returned from her walk when 3-year-old Victoria Bench wanted to play on the porch. Eating to make lunch, her mother decided to let her play and felt comfortable leaving her on the porch with the family dog. Only inside for a few moments, upon her return, Victoria was nowhere to be seen, and the dog was missing too. The family searched for them for about an hour before contacting the police. By the time the police got to the area, they only had about 30 minutes of daylight left to search. The search area was rugged and had lots of foliage. The police also decided to search other homes in the area for offenders of minor children, but nothing was found. The next morning, the police were able to get a helicopter in the air, and shortly after, spotted the little girl laying under a bush. She was a half a mile away from her home, and her companion, Blue, the dog, was right by her side. Victoria was wearing only tennis shoes, a short-sleeved shirt, and light pants. It's surmised that the dog stayed with her and kept her warm through the night. Otherwise, it's not believed that she could have survived temperatures that were in the low 30s. Victoria was transported to an area hospital as a precaution for a checkup and was reunited with her family later that day, right along with her loyal friend and faithful companion, Blue. And finally, we have Into the Alps, the story of Matt Briggs and his dog. Having planned a week-long hiking trip into the Alps of New Zealand, 33-year-old Matt Briggs, an avid outdoors enthusiast and hunter, and his companion, Little Dog, headed off into the wilderness of arguably the most beautiful landscape the area had to offer. Having been hiking for 4 days already of a planned 10-day trip, Matt and his loyal companion were having a wonderful time, but were having to take caution because the mountains in some areas are nearly vertical, which makes for a difficult hike, as one would imagine. Resting on a ridge at above 6,000 feet sea level, Matt was taking extra care when placing his footing, as a fall could mean certain death. Ready to start descending and head to the valley floor for the day, Matt had just reached a corner on the cliff he was standing on and was about to start looking for the best way down when suddenly the rock he was standing on came loose and broke off from the cliff. The whole slab of the cliff broke off and took Matt with it, in a free fall down a mountain slope. There wasn't much Matt could do except try to keep himself as steady as possible and stay on the slab. Losing his balance and falling in front of it, he would be crushed to death. Realizing there was a bluff coming up and that he was going to free fall, he tried to stay just as steady as possible. As he fell over the edge, over 30 feet, he landed on his back, surrounded by jagged rocks and another sheer cliff face. Surprised that he was still alive and that his back wasn't broken, Matt tried to stand up and take stock of his injuries. As he stood and put weight on his arm, his wrist gave way with what was once fractured to now being fully broken. Using his left hand to balance himself and get to his feet, he quickly checked the rest of his body. Putting weight on his right leg seemed fine, but the left ankle was miserably broken. Matt had left word with colleagues that his trip would last for 7 to 10 days, so he realized no one would be looking for him for at least another week. Also, right by the area Matt had landed was a small creek. Looking at the color of the water, he saw that the creek had started to turn bright red. Quickly checking himself once more for lacerations, he noticed he had a very deep cut on the back of his left thigh. He couldn't see the cut, but he could feel it with his hand. A huge amount of the red life elixir was pouring from the cut. Matt, trying to determine how deep the cut was, used his fingers to measure and found it to be 2 knuckles deep, 2-finger length, 1/2-inch wide gash. Matt knew that if he had hit a major artery, he could quickly pass out and not wake up. He needed to have this attended to, but fast. The dog had now found his way to Matt and was ever glad to see him. He pulled Little Dog close and checked him for injuries. Luckily, the dog didn't have any visible injuries, and there was no blood visible either. Naturally, the dog seemed shaken and nervous, but no worse for the wear. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for his master. Matt was in bad shape indeed, but luckily he had remembered to bring his GPS emergency locator beacon, a small first aid kit, food rations for both he and Little Dog, an emergency blanket, and seasonings for his food. This fact will be important later. Digging the supplies out of his pack that thankfully hadn't lost during the fall, he wanted to get to the GPS locator beacon first so he could alert the authorities to his plight. Locating the kit, he opened it and found the compass, but there was no emergency location device in the bag. Matt grabbed some thermals and some cotton cloth from his pack, applied pressure to the open wound, and wrapped it to hold the bandaging in place. Within about 10 minutes, the heavy bleeding had ceased and the wound was only weeping. Little Dog had made his way to the bottom of the cliff and was keeping his distance from the fractured rock. Matt surmised the Little Dog felt something was amiss and wanted to keep a safe distance in case of another rock slide. Each night they had been in the back country, there had been a frost. Knowing this was going to be an issue, Matt had to plan on finding a place that was safe and large enough to set up shelter so they could stay warm and out of the weather. He found a flat, grassy area that fit the bill and was able to drag himself down the cliffside to the very spot. There he was able to set up a tent, and he was right by the creek where they could have water. Exhausted and having found his sleeping bag had fallen out of his pack and into the creek, Matt had to build a fire to dry out the gear and to aid in keeping them warm because night was coming on fast. He knew the sun going down meant freezing temperatures for sure. The sleeping bag didn't dry out in time, so the first night he used his extra clothes and Little Dog for warmth and was very thankful to have both. The next day, Matt woke to the sound of aircraft that was bringing other hunters into the area and dropping them off. Using his bright orange emergency blanket, he desperately tried to get their attention. But it was no use. They were simply too far away. Knowing he would probably be spending a few more days out in these conditions, he had to find a way to disinfect the wound on his thigh. Remembering he had salt in his pack for food flavoring, Matt remembered from his survival classes that salt could be used as a disinfectant for first aid situations in a pinch. He flushed the area out as best he could and packed it with salt. Cooking was been a challenge anyway because he hadn't brought any extra fuel, thinking he would have plenty of wood in the area he would be preparing his food. However, he was in the high country, above the tree line, and there wasn't a lot of items that close that could be collected to cook with. Matt had to conserve the little fuel he did have, so he decided to cook every other day and make enough for a couple of days at a time for him and little dog. He was also rationing the food and had cut his food and the dog's to just a quarter of what they would normally eat. They had rice, a few packets of dried soup, dehydrated vegetables, and energy bars. The bars would be saved for days when he would try to walk for extra energy. Having little dog along kept Matt going. He was happy that he was there to keep him company, and they were cuddling at night to keep warm. Each day he would clean his wound and repack and wrap it to keep it clean and as dry as possible, and it seemed to be working, at least for now. Another morale booster was a small radio he kept in his pack. He could pick up a signal from a station. It was at least a voice to listen to in the darkness, Matt recalled during an interview. So far, the weather had been cold but dry and sunny. Matt knew this wasn't going to last, however, for he was as infamously known to have raging weather, especially in the winter. Getting weather broadcasts from the radio, the bad news finally came on Tuesday. Thursday would see a rather cold and snowy front move through the area and would last at least into the following day. Knowing the dangers of being exposed to that kind of weather, Matt chose to try and test what he was capable of with his injuries. If he could at least stand and find something to use for a crutch, he may be able to make it to help. Rising to his feet and using a nearby boulder to steady himself, he tried to place a little pressure at a time on the ankle. Pain shot through his body like a jolt of electricity, and he almost passed out. Moving areas wasn't going to happen on that day. The sky started to darken late Wednesday, and the wind was picking up. By Friday, indeed, the rain was coming in sheets and battering the two of them. It was also flooding the small creek by their camp. Matt wasn't in a way that they could move, and thankfully the creek didn't take over and flood the area. By Friday night, the storm had subsided and was exiting. This was the day Matt was due back, and because he left word with friends, he was expecting a rescue by the next day. However, Saturday came and went, as well as Sunday, Monday, then finally on Tuesday, Matt decided he would have to rescue himself with little dog's help. Matt spent Wednesday morning observing the valley below him. Off in the distance, about 2 days' hike for him in his condition, was a small hunting cabin. Between him and the cabin was the rest of the cliff, thick bramble that he would have to navigate, an almost vertical hike, then he would be at the valley floor. He stood and, using his 2 tent poles he had taped together as a cane, steadied himself and practiced walking using the equipment he had made in his self-rescue. He could only put weight on his right leg, so he had to take it extra easy and mentally prepare himself for the journey ahead. Hoping there would be extra food at the hunting cabin and maybe even people, he knew he had to make this happen. He packed up his area and with little dog's help, started the long trek down the mountain. Called Tiger Country because of the tough scrub brush, in a normal situation it would take him days to get through because it was so thick. Matt was hoping it wouldn't take him that long, but knew in his condition it could possibly take even longer. It took Matt a whole day to get through the subalpine terrain of the first area. He still had to get through the forest and down the almost vertical mountain. At this point, his leg was turning black and purple from the bruising, and the weight that's having to be put on it was excruciating. No matter how bad the pain was, though, he knew he had to push through. His wrist wasn't faring much better. The fingers on that hand kept going numb from the cold. Matt would have to stop and manually move them around to keep them at least semi-warm. The forest and vertical parts took about 4 hours to get through. He was now about 200 meters away from the valley floor. The tree section was the last hard part he had to get through, or so he thought. He would have to take a few steps, hook his one good arm through the branches, and lower himself down the steeper parts. Finally, at the valley floor, Matt could see the hunting cabin. His relief was immediately replaced by disappointment, however. The rains from the week before had caused the small stream to swell into a raging river. Water was rushing over boulders, and it looked like Matt might be stuck on the opposite side of this river from the cabin. Giving one last push to make his way to shelter and safety, Matt and Little Dog walked down the stream, looking for a safe place to cross. About 20 yards ahead was the one area that looked like they might be able to cross. But just downstream, there was a 2-meter waterfall, and not wanting to be thrown from another cliff, Matt knew he couldn't cross here. He hobbled another 3 miles upriver, again looking for a perfect spot to cross. His legs were bruised and battered. His knees had taken a beating from Matt having to walk on them so unnaturally. They were starting to get very weak. Still, with all the strength he could muster, he pushed on. He found a place that looked like it might be the best place to cross, but there was also ice in this part of the water, and that made it even colder. As soon as he entered the water, the chill caused his muscles to tense, which drove the pain to an almost unbearable level. Little Dog was hesitating on the bank, running back and forth, not wanting to jump in. When Matt was about halfway across the river, Little Dog jumped in, swam over, and climbed right onto Matt's back as if hitching a ride. "We had a few words, as you can imagine," Matt said, but Matt was glad he made the decision to come along. As soon as they got to the bank, Matt found that he could no longer stand. The icy water had numbed the pain, but also caused his legs to seize up. Little Dog took off and immediately started barking and running around as if to attract attention to them. It took Matt about half an hour to get warmed up enough to get moving again. All the while, Little Dog was still barking and running around. The hunter's cabin was another 2 miles back down the stream. Little Dog ran ahead. Matt could see boot prints in the mud and thought that must mean there were people at the cabin. This gave him renewed hope that they would find help, and sure enough, as he rounded the last corner right before the cabin, there was a hunter patting Little Dog and carrying a water bucket. There were 2 hunters there. They had finally reached safety and rescue. The hunter thought Matt had simply sprained his ankle, but as he made his way closer to the man, he could see that Matt was much worse off than he had initially thought. He rushed over and offered to carry Matt, but Matt had walked all that way on his own, and in his words said, "I wasn't about to let anyone carry me the last 100 meters." Sheer determination had driven Matt to find help for Little Dog and himself. Matt even let Little Dog eat first, and then he ate. It took one of the hunters another full day to walk out of the area and to get help for Matt and Little Dog. Matt was flown to a hospital. Doctors determined that the wrist was blown out and would never heal properly, and the ankle was almost as bad. They took grafts from other areas of the body to help Matt's prognosis for a full recovery, though. To this day, he and Little Dog still hike the mountains. "The whole incident gave me perspective," Matt says. "It made me realize what was important in life and what wasn't. And it really gave me the drive to control and actually choose the direction my life was going to take, and not merely go just wherever life took me. It never occurred to me that I wasn't going to get through this. I had that determination always to take the next step and do what was required to get myself out of there. And through it all, Little Dog was right there with him. Not all angels have wings. Some of them have fur." Well, folks, there you have it. What do you think of these amazing stories of survival where people and their best friend and companion made it through against all odds? I look forward to your comments, but please keep it friendly and respectful. In the meantime, be good to yourselves and each other. And if you have an animal, give them a hug. And my dog Mulder and I will see you a little further on down the trail. I'm Steve Stockton, and I'll talk to you next time.